So the first thing I'm going to do is present a small presentation that I gave to attend to give to researcher when I was at the University of Luxembourg. So, so obviously I'm not going to go through the actual content because it's things that you know about. But what I wanted to give an insight is, you know, on the training part of how do I build the idea behind this. So a lot of the time I hear a lot of different misconceptions from researchers, and so I built this this talk to really educate them and to make sure that they retain only one or two information coming out, which is usually that, you know, you can deposit on a repository and that makes it open access. So obviously I go through what open science, open access is. This is the background where there's the national funder that is part of Coalition S with the European Commission, Horizon Europe, to give them a bit of the background of why we're giving this kind of talk. So the first myth I go through is because they see it a lot of the time as something that is an admin step, an extra step to do it. And so I briefly go over this. When it's PhD students, I tend to go a bit more in depth of the research, the publication lifecycle, and the different ways that the publishers get their money from, and the double tipping. But usually with researchers, I just show this slide and I just say, you know, basically you're as a taxpayer, you're paying twice. I put also back in the context, I think that's something that is important to do in your country. Not only, so Luxembourg is a small country, so I focused only on, well, I focused on the national context, but I would not only do that, but also at the institutional level, especially if you have a bigger institution and they're spending a lot of money on journal subscriptions. I would try and extract the data that what you're paying in terms of the consortium, if you're part of a library consortium. If you're not part of an actual institution, I would still give some ideas of the local, regional, national context to give a number basically to researchers so that they realize how much is being spent. I've started also last year adding the APCs, because we have now that number in Luxembourg. And I think it's also a big number to, so not just general subscription, but also to show how much is spent in article processing charges. I give back also the context of, you know, the profit margin that the publishers are making compared to other big companies like Google and Apple. And then I go through different 3 or 4 different myths and misconceptions. So the first thing I really focus on is for them to try and understand that open access is not about it's a publishing model. It's not about an actual journal. That obviously there are some fully open access journals, but I really insist on the fact that open access is different from a journal. There are different ways that you can make it. The second myth that you might also go over, get a lot, is that to do open access, it's only the gold route and that you have to pay APCs to be able to publish. So I insist a lot on this so that people understand that you don't necessarily have to pay to be able to be compliant with your funder. So now I explain the green and the gold route. I don't focus on the gold route because people know about it, where it's an APC. Obviously now there's the diamond route where there's no APCs, it's open access. Melissa will go over that after me. But I really focus on the self-archiving. And I always say this is the most important slide that in the talk, if you only want to remember one, it's that one. And actually, and this is something I do also when I really want an information to be retained, because we know that people won't retain everything. They will retain one or two elements from an hour talk. So this slide, I actually show it twice or even 3 times sometimes to really anchor the fact that that's the element I want them to remember. I go back to my awful diagram to show them basically of how the green route works in terms of embargo periods, because until very recently, the embargo period was allowed. So I still mention it. But at that point, I do say that to be careful because there are some new developments in that context. So the presentation I used to give 5 years ago is quite different from the one I gave last year, with the embargoes being not allowed anymore by Plan S or by the Horizon Europe. This one is quite classic, you know, the social networking like ResearchGate or academia.edu not being an open access repository. At that point, I mentioned OpenDoor, Zenodo if they have need a generic one. And then I also mentioned for Horizon Europe projects, Open Research Europe. I go through, I do it slightly different nowadays, but I go through what the different versions of the manuscripts, so from preprint to then the peer review happens. Then what we call postprint is now author accepted manuscripts. So depending on who I'm talking to, if it's early stage researchers, I will only mention author accepted manuscript and say it's the reviewed manuscript. But when I'm talking to people who've been in research for longer, I do mention postprint because they probably heard that term before. And then I use the publisher's version of record, again, same thing, if depending on who I'm talking. The one thing I say also during my talk is that the author accepted manuscript is what I call the ugly version of the publisher's version, because it's the publisher just keeps the same content, but it makes it shiny. So that's how I say it orally to people so that they maybe remember. I always try and have the more serious way of presenting it, and then try and find ways of making it a bit more intuitive to people that might process information differently, because we know that people will are more visual, more auditive and all that. So I always try and mix different techniques to make attendants learn the information. I mentioned Sherpa Romeo. Now I actually don't, because for Horizon Europe, the journal checker tool is fully compliant since a month. Sherpa Romeo is very useful, but it's quite confusing for some, so I tend to just avoid it when I'm talking only to researchers. If I'm talking to research support staff, I will mention it so that they can go in a bit more in depth. I put the slide I put before. I go slightly further by saying that you do have that option to pay for to publish open access, but I insist that you should still deposit on a repository. So as you see, I'm hammering this information as much as possible. Now, because when I started giving this talk, there was no information from the funder in terms of, so the funder applied Plan S, but they didn't really advertise it. So in my talk, I give some context of why it suddenly changed. And so I give the difference between up to 2020 and then from 2021 onwards. So the difference is with the embargo period, the hybrid journals being accepted before, that now there's no embargo period, you need to retain your rights on at least the author accepted manuscripts. that hybrid are not allowed except if they're part of a transformative agreement. This is, it's a bit of a gray area because in Luxembourg, we have read and publish deals, but the consortium, the people that are the consortium really want to think that they're transformative agreements, and they keep saying they're transformative agreements, even if in the agreement there's nothing saying that the journal will convert to full open access. The funder, I don't know why, is accepting also that. So it's a bit, I don't know if it's the same case in other countries, but you might have a difference between the theory of what you learn and trying to apply basically the law and the rules, and what in practice is accepted by the local funder, the national funder or the local funder. So it's something to bear in mind also. Politics do play a big role, unfortunately. I go back to what, because I mentioned on these slides the Creative Commons license, so I go back to just showing what a Creative Commons license is, and I mentioned the fact that you know, it's basically the same as the way I present the CC BY license is basically saying you'll always cite researchers when you're citing papers. It's the same basically. We're asking you to cite the paper and the authors. And so linked to APCs and transformative deals that increased a lot in the Western world. There's this myth now that you have to pay to be published. And so there it's where it becomes slightly more complicated, because you need to convey the information that they have the power as researchers, because sometimes they don't feel that they have any say in anything. And I keep saying, no, you actually have a lot of power. If you want to the publisher or the heads of your institution to change things, you just have to be a certain number of researchers complaining, and then they will do it. Still not found a good way of trying to convey that information, but yes, I always try and talk about the rights retention strategy on how they can push it forward with the publisher. Because even if the publisher says no, I still recommend them to actually try it, because the more people try it, and the more it will be more common, basically. So that's the rights retention strategy that Melissa will also mention later on. And the new myth also linked to that, and the transformative agreements, and the fact that you cannot publish in hybrid journals. At that time, when I was presenting, there was no deals with the consortium. So the way of, also because you have to protect yourself a bit sometimes, because you're not the people taking decisions. So I always, and maybe that's just my strategy of being very transparent and blunt about things, but when I'm asked this type of questions, or, you know, yes, but we could do this, I just say, I'm just giving you this information. I have no say. This is the funder. If you want to complain, it's up to the funder. I'm just conveying this information. So I've had a lot of tensions with this, and I tried protecting myself from this kind of talks, because in my experience, they didn't really lead anywhere, because it's a lot of brainstorming. But obviously I have some thoughts about it, but I try and present in a more neutral way. I talk about the journal checker tool, show how it's presented, and then a reminder. So usually sometimes here I put the, I don't know if I put, no, I put the slide again of the insisting on the fact that you can just have the, you can go for the depositing on the repository. and insists that you have to self-archive whatever you do. Yeah, so that's basically what I used to do, because now I don't work at the University of Luxembourg. But yeah, just to give you an idea of how I do things, and I'm interested also in how you might do things differently.